Greetings, folks. I'm Rod Machado, and I'm pleased to introduce my new e-learning course on in-flight emergencies. And the primary goal of this course is to answer two questions that are often on every pilot's mind. How safe are the airplanes we fly? And if anything happens in an airplane, will I be able to handle the problem? You see, unlike airline pilots, corporate pilots, and military pilots, private pilots are often not provided with significant training on handling in-flight emergencies. And in many instances, the private pilot is given the POH, pointed to a corner of the flight school and told to read the emergency section. And this often comprises the total of a pilot's emergency training. Unfortunately, the POH is often silent on, or at least offers very little depth on the techniques for handling many possible, though rare, in-flight emergencies. As a result of this deficiency of information, a subtle but often, significant transformation might occur in some pilots. As we acquire more experience, we typically begin to wonder what we would do if an emergency happened while aloft and how we would handle it. And after several hundred hours thinking about these questions and having no immediate and satisfying answers to them, anxiety begins to take root and begins to grow in a pilot's mind. Now, should that anxiety reach a significant level, a pilot might wake up one day and find him or herself making excuses not to fly. After all, no flight means no anxiety about flight. And the problem is that we spend a lot of our precious time and money learning to do something we love doing and are now compelled to abandon it just to have some peace of mind. Well, I don't want that to happen to you. Thus the reason for this course. In addition to covering the in-flight emergencies pilots are most likely to encounter, and these are the ones that you've thought about before, this course also addresses some of the most unusual, bizarre, strange emergencies that a pilot might experience. Now, my intent is not to scare you here. The odds are on your side. Nevertheless, if you know how to handle these rare events, you will no longer feel intimidated, anxious, or uncomfortable during flight. You'll no longer find yourself making excuses not to fly an airplane. And if anything, you'll feel more confident as a pilot by the knowledge presented here, because knowledge is empowering. As Pope John Paul II once said, otherwise known as J2P2, Scientia es potentia, which means knowledge is power. So come with me and let's start learning about handling in-flight emergencies. Picking the best place to make an emergency landing. So where should you attempt an emergency landing should you be in the unlucky position to have had an engine failure? Well, you often have several choices. There are airports, fields, roads, forests, bodies of water, and so on. Clearly, if an airport is available for landing, then use it if you feel it is safe. But don't deny yourself other options if you don't feel you can actually glide to an airport. For example, other than airports, roads are a very safe place to land if an engine quits. Yes, they're essentially an airstrip that is occasionally being used by cars, more than occasionally. Do you know that 95% of all emergency landings on roads result in no injury to the pilots? That's right. Find some solace in that fact. In fact, we don't quite know how many people actually land on a road, often because they ran out of fuel, and then take back off again. That's how safe a road landing can be. But do keep in mind that power lines often cross or run parallel to roads. Power lines crossing highways are less common because downed lines can cause a massive traffic pileup at freeway speeds. Crop duster pilots know this one very important thing about power lines. They are very difficult to see. That's why a crop duster pilot, upon recognizing the likelihood of power lines crossing a road, will get as close to the ground as possible as he or she flies underneath them. Of course, flat fields are great too. What about plowed fields? Well, land into the wind, preferably parallel with the furrows, but not directly across them when possible. Then again, landing into the wind takes priority when it comes to landing on a plowed field. Now, what about crops? Crops such as corn, wheat, and barley slow the airplane down very efficiently. If you have to land in an orchard, you'll certainly try landing between the trees. Now, what about forests? Well, the issue here is the density of the growth and the size of the trees. Clearly, a less dense forest with trees having small trunks is better. The question here is, suppose you have to land on the top of the trees in a very dense forest. Well, if you're landing on an Amazonian rainforest canopy, you'll probably mesh right in with the trees and be able to climb down once you get directions from a monkey. Unfortunately, in the United States, we often don't have tree canopies as thick as they do in the Amazon, and our supply of monkeys has thinned out quite a bit too. What you don't want to have happen is attempt to land on a tree canopy without the density to support the airplane. In this instance, the airplane could hit the trees and fall to the ground inverted. Remember, there's very little shock absorption possible when making contact with the ground using the top of the cockpit cabin. And as we discussed earlier, because of the higher stall speeds of today's general aviation airplanes, landing into the top of trees becomes a less favorable technique than it once was when flying airplanes of the, well, let's say the J3 Cub and the Tailorcraft type. Now, sometimes there just aren't any real clear answers to these questions. If you have a chance, you can drive into the mid portion of the trees where the stalks aren't as thick and you'd have less distance to fall. Whatever you do, don't give up control of your airplane until you absolutely have no choice. You fly that thing all the way down for as long as possible. It should go without saying that you want to land into the wind if at all possible. Think about it this way. If your approach speed is 60 knots and you have a 20-knot wind, then the difference in ground speed between landing with a tailwind and a headwind is not 20 knots. It's 40 knots. With a tailwind, your ground speed would be 80 knots. With a headwind, your ground speed would be 40 knots. That's a 40-knot difference, and it makes the difference between being a survivable accident and a non-survivable one.
And it was.
Looking good, dude. Slow it down. Come on in, just hold it off. Oh, you're gonna go a ways down, that's okay. Hold it off as long as possible. All right, good job. Yeah. Hey, that was me. Good job. Good deal. There's the man with the plan.